Okay, we start with a door today. Very important, this door today. By the way, this is one of my favorite door pictures because of how carved it is. I'll close up on sections of it, like this right side over here, this ornate carving of stuff in it. I blow this picture up on my computer and just study the carving. And then if you actually go to the top lintel over the top there, beautiful detail in this door. This door sort of represents for us today the doorway into people's hearts and lives, their inner lives. And it's always very ornately enamored with things that they've built over their entire lives, these things that talk about, this is the gateway to who I am, this is me. There's another side also over here, just above the door. It's great. It actually has fishes. See the fishes? Woo! They're really, really nice. And then last, there's an ornate side on the left that we don't have time to look at. But I'm studying that door because that door represents, this represents the portal into people's inner lives. And they have this door that's very ornate and very carefully designed, and it's closed. And we're going to look at how Paul opens the doors into people's lives as he comes to Athens and he talks about the gospel. And why this door thing, it'll become clear in just a second, but it's really super critical. So let me catch up where we are. We're on Jesus Tour number 2 that started in Antioch, and we left it a couple weeks ago. That the yellow line is how far that Paul has come so far. He came all the way across Turkey. He got in a boat at Troas. He went over to Philippi, remember that? And then over to Berea, and then took a boat down to Athens. That's the island of Crete right there, which Titus was tasked with putting elders across the island. But we came into Athens, which is right here at the bottom of Greece. Big city. Hasn't been a big city for a long time. And we center in the middle of the city where there's an interesting rock outcropping that for generations has been a spiritual place. And on top of it today is the Parthenon. So there's this broad plain that Athens is, and then there's a rock outcropping. But even though Paul was asked to speak about spiritual things, they're not going to ask him to speak in this spiritual spot of the Parthenon. They're going to ask him to speak on a rock outcropping that's just next to it, just west of it, and that outcropping is called the Areopagus. So today we have Paul in the Areopagus. They asked him to come and speak and to describe and in detail what it is he's talking about this Jesus. They want him to tell everyone who's interested to come, and the Areopagus was the place where you had these discussions. So now, big drum roll, he's on the Areopagus. By the way, Areopagus comes from Ares, the god of war, Pagus, a hill. This is the god of war's hill, which is why in some translations it's not translated Areopagus. But for those of us who understand the god of war, Greek is Ares, the god of war, Roman is Mars Hill. So sometimes they call this Mars Hill. So he's on the Areopagus, the place where everyone's come to listen to him, and he has this great opportunity to talk about the gospel. So this is how he starts out today. We're going to look at it. Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious. And in discussing the gospel, this is a door. Okay, now why is this a door? Because in many people's lives, no one wants to hear about Jesus. No one wants to hear about the fact that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Somehow, when you start to talk about the gospel, you need to look for a doorway into people's lives because their doors are closed. What you have to say is largely irrelevant to them. It's irrelevant. So this is a doorway of relevance into the hearts and belief systems of people. You have to look for a door to find a door of relevance. And the door of relevance that he uses with them before he hits them with the gospel is, I notice you're religious people. And they would respond, well, yeah, we're religious people. This is the same result as when I said before I get on an airplane, sit next to somebody, and I ask them, do you have an interest in spiritual things? Is that door open or closed? Well, he has looked around the city and noticed that they do have an interest in religious things. Okay, so what he's going to do is he's going to pursue this avenue because he knows that this door will probably be slightly open. Now, how does he know that they're interested in religious things? He tells them, as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found also an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God. So, what therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. And you can hear the doors open just a crack. They're religious people. They're interested in spiritual things. They have this temple, this altar to this unknown God. And yes, we don't know who this unknown God is. You mean you have the answer? This is right in line with what we're interested in. We have an interest right in it. So the doors creak open, and Paul has an opportunity to talk about something of importance. Now, I stress this because many times when we talk about the gospel with people, we usually just take a truckload of gospel information and dump it on them and hope that somehow they can sort out and all of that kind of stuff what's relevant to them. You have to do them a service and find a relevant opportunity of where it's going to link up with their interests. This is a big deal. Well, a while ago, we in Sunday school, adult Sunday school, we looked at this book, Tactics. And in Tactics, he talks about the fact that what you need to do is start from some level of interest, some level of relevance. And he gave a great illustration of going to a convenience store, like a 7-Eleven, and as he goes up to pay for his coffee or whatever it is, he gets to the front counter, finds that the gal behind the counter is a very, very interestingly dressed, and she also is wearing a pentagram, right, on a chain. And so he knows what the pentagram stands for, but clearly this is something important to her. And in the book, he just describes the fact that he's paying for it, and while he's just paying stuff and doing regular life, so I notice you're wearing that star thing. That looks like it means something important to you. Yes, this does mean something important to me. Well, can you sort of describe what's important about it? I mean, I've never seen him wear anything like that before. Does it mean something? Is it about the star? And so he talks about this whole discussion. He's focused on something that's interesting to her, that clearly she has some kind of invested something in. And he decides to start there with her because that's something she's interested in. And he pursues that interest. It's a doorway. And in the doorway, then he finds opportunity to talk about the gospel. Now, he doesn't get fully into the gospel, but he gets to a point where he starts to bring a curiosity about the gospel to her. And that's where they run out of time and they exchange the cash and they're all done. But this is what I'm saying. This is what we have to do as well. Paul notices this in Athens. He's in Athens, which is the most professional philosophy center of the world. And how are you supposed to present the gospel to these people? How are you supposed to find a doorway of entry that's relevant about the gospel to a people like this? How do you start the conversation? And so this is how he does it. He sees this altar, unknown God. Curious about this unknown God? I can tell you all about him. Well, yes, we are. And on that basis, they ask him to speak at the Areopagus. You have to find relevant doorways in people's lives. Now, let me give you an example of what's probably more relevant, because people struggle all the time. Everyone you meet will be struggling with something. And if you're listening to their lives, if you're closer to them than just acquaintance, you hear the struggles and you talk about those struggles. And you can talk about how Jesus met those struggles and other people say in the New Testament. You can talk about how God's loving kindness toward us is aimed toward that. And then you can talk about struggles. You can talk about spiritual interests. You can talk about UFOs. I mean, you can use anything that people have interest in, but the key to finding a door to talk about the gospel is listening. You can't share the gospel until you listen. Find out where their interest is. Find out where that interest overlaps with what they might want to understand about the gospel, and then you go with it. Unless you have that, you're just dumping a dump truck of theology on people and hoping they can sort it out. So anyway, okay, so this is what he notices. That's the first step. So now what do you say? Paul's ready to go. He has these people who are dominated by other things. They're biblically ignorant. They have no clue what's in the Bible, Old Testament. I mean, these are Greeks that live in Athens. They know more about Aristotle and Plato than they do the Bible. They are dominated by Greek mythology, Zeus, Ares, even the hill they're standing on, Ares, the god of war, Diana. I mean, they're dominated by this, and they believe that everything in our life is kind of slightly connected to this pantheon of gods who, if you play your cards right, they'll be happy with you and things will be good today. If you play your cards badly, that'll be a bad day. They're dominated by this unseen, suspicious world of the gods. How do you deal with that? Also, they're dominated by logic, the Aristotle and Plato logic, which actually is pretty good stuff and will be used by Paul to his advantage as he talks to them. But they're dominated by Platonic and Aristotelian logic and rules. Nothing wrong with that. In fact, most of our science, a lot of Western culture actually is based on Aristotle in a good sort of way. Okay, but they've got that, which means they're just going to be very picky about what you say. They're going to be very careful about hearing what you're saying. And then finally, he already told us, they come to the Areopagus sort of as entertainment because they just like hearing new stuff. So what they want to hear from Paul is something that's entertaining. So what can he tell them when they're looking for something that's, when we talk about entertaining, many times I think about those weird newspapers that you see on the street in New York City that have those splashy headlines about the monkey boy or the UFOs or that kind of crazy stuff. It's entertaining stuff to listen to. That's what they want. They want Paul to tell them something they've never heard before that's kind of entertaining. They'll use Aristotelian logic to kind of pick it apart and show how worthless he is. And they'll also try and confuse it with which God are you talking about? Are you talking about Zeus? Or are you talking about Ares? Who are you talking about? And so they're just there for a great afternoon as Paul's standing up there. And now the onus is on Paul. What in the world do you say to people who haven't got a clue what's in the Bible? And this is what they're dominated by. Wouldn't you hate to be in his shoes? But he's got the Holy Spirit. He's opened a door of interest just a little bit. The unknown God. They want to listen to what he has to say. They're motivated to hear what he has to say. Now, Paul, don't blow it. Here we go. We're going to find out what he says. Well, before we look at what he says, I'm going to tell you something that Jesus said. Because I think this sets a context for you to understand why Paul does what he does coming up next. And this is the story I want to tell you. You find it in 3 Gospels right there. There's this part, and I'll just mention to you because you probably know this parable. Jesus talks about this landowner who owns a vineyard, and he owns a place to make wine in that vineyard. And in that vineyard, he gets it all prepped to be productive, to make tons of money, but then he can't work there, so he hires tenant farmers to come and work the land. You remember this parable? So you can go read it. So it's the exact same as those 3 Gospels. He goes there, and he says, okay, I'm going to give this to you to work. You don't own this land. You don't own this winemaking equipment. By the way, winemaking equipment at the time looks like this. This is actually in the island of Cyprus. And about the time, 1st century, where this big screw over here and this big beam way over there and that thing in the far right of the beam is where they would put grapes and it would squish it with leverage. And it would come out, trip out the front and come onto the ground down here, be caught right here, go through these different basins, and you'd have grape juice filling up in these things. Cool. So he's built all this apparatus to make wine. So it's a money-making venture, and the owner says to the tenant farmers, you can work this, but, by the way, at the time, you paid for being able to work someone else's land by paying them 10% of what you grossed on the grapes. That's why tithe in the Old Testament is 10%. It's what tenant farmers pay to the owner of the land. That's what the Jews paid to the owner of the land of Israel for living in God's land. That's tithing. Okay, so he says, this is all here. So you work this, and I'll come back and collect. So sure enough, they work it for a couple years or something. They're making money at it. The owner of the vineyard comes, and he asks them for his 10%. And remember what happens to the guys who he sends to collect the 10%? They are not well respected. In fact, they're kind of trashed, abused, kicked out. And then finally, the owner of the land, remember what the owner does as his last resort? He says, I'll send them my son. They will respect my son. And sure enough, he sends his son. Do they respect his son? No. They say, look, it's the son. He's the one who's going to inherit this land. If we kill him, we can take the land. And so they kill the son instead of paying their 10%. So then Jesus asks them, what do you think the owner of the vineyard ought to do? And of course they say, well, they ought to bring down justice on these guys. I mean, after all, they're squatters in a way. They're using this land and they're not paying for it. And they're not even recognizing the fact that the owner of the land is the owner of the land. That's just wrong. That's just wrong. So in this story, we have the owner of the land, we have his son, we have his messengers, we have the tenant farmers who refuse to recognize the authority and right of the person who owns the land, and there is judgment coming on them as a result. Okay, you got that whole parable in your mind? Paul's going to use this picture. I've got it in my mind. He's going to use this picture to tell them about the gospel in a way that's probably unconventional in Israel, but very purposeful in a pagan society. Okay? Here we go. You ready? You got that in the back of your head? Well, in the story, we have basically what I call 3 sections. You have the landlord's nature, that is, he is rich, he owns everything, he's generous, he's thoughtful, but he expects a return. But he actually is very generous with them. Then you got the tenants. Their purpose is to work the land and give the percentage back to the owner, and to kind of be respectful of the owner while they have this great opportunity of living in his generosity, right? And then you have the vineyard's destiny. Well, the vineyard's destiny is to go back to the owner of the vineyard. The tenants are never going to own it. He owns it. So that's the destiny. So that's kind of my rough rule of thumb about this story. And that colors what I see as the three sections of what Paul's going to talk about. In a bigger sense, take the vineyard as being all the earth. Okay, and we're the tenants, and God owns this place. So Paul's going to go into a big picture view, the biggest picture view you can get about what's going on in the gospel, about God's nature, and then about man's purpose in all of this stuff as being tenants of this land, and then finally what creation's destiny is. So he's going to take the biggest picture he possibly can, keep thinking about this vineyard, and equate the vineyard to the world. And you're the tenants. Okay? Here we go. Let's see what Paul says. Well, the God who made the world and everything in it, see, he's the landowner, the God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth. So he's going to start here. This is the landowner definition. This God that I'm talking about, Paul says, this God that is unseen by you, that you don't know anything about, the God I'm talking about made everything. He's not just in charge of like one thing or another like your gods are. He's in charge of everything. He made the earth and everything in it. He's Lord. And when you see the word Lord, always think authority. I always use the word boss and I stick it in my head. He's the boss of everything. He's in charge of everything. He's in tops of everything. And not only just the world and everything in it, but heaven and earth. There's nothing that this God is not bigger than. This is a big deal. Big deal. So when you compare it to the pantheon of Greek gods, this God Paul's talking about makes these Greek gods just pale in comparison. I mean, Zeus is a big dude, but Zeus is nothing compared to the God Paul's talking about right here. This is a God, a single God who's bigger than all. By the way, that's why when you get to Deuteronomy 6, the great Shema, we call it, where we instruct Israel, hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one, rather than many. Greek pantheon. That's why he says the Lord your God is one. Therefore, you don't have to split your attention between Zeus and Diana and Ares. You can have single-minded devotion to the one God because, hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. And you need to love him with all of who you are, not subdivided to the different gods. So that's what the Shema is all about, the single God. And that's what he says right here. There is this single God, and he's in charge of everything. Forget all the little gods. The God I'm talking about is bigger than everything. So, he doesn't live in temples made by man. Well, of course, when you realize how big God is, does God live in temples? And he could actually point right up the hill on top of the Acropolis, and he could see the Parthenon up there. He could probably point up there and said, God does not live in temples made by man. No. I mean, this picture is taken just from the side where the Areopagus is. That's exactly the view that Paul could have as he's talking to them. God does not live in temples made by man. Why? Because he made everything. He's bigger than everything. Everything. No. Nor is he served by human hands. As though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. So this God I'm talking about doesn't need you. He doesn't need you. He doesn't need you to come up and do your morning, sacrifices and your evening sacrifices. He doesn't need you to do the things in this temple up there. He doesn't need you to do that. And by the way, if you turn over to the Old Testament, God doesn't need Israel to do their sacrifices. You know who needs the sacrifices? Israel does. Not God. Does God go starving if they don't bring sacrifices? No. However, in the Greek pantheon idea, you did stuff to sort of serve the gods and as such kind of keep them alive. And if you did the right stuff for the gods, they would keep you alive. It was kind of a parasitic relationship. So they could do that. But here, he's saying, no, God is big enough. He doesn't need any of that stuff. He doesn't need anything you can give because he gives everything. Everything comes from him. So we've painted a picture which for us is pretty routine. When you look in the Old Testament and you hear what Jesus says, yeah, that's who God is. But to a pagan mind, this is whacked out huge. By the way, to the modern science mind, this is whacked out huge. Because what we're saying is, as we look in our telescopes and we see the extent of the universe, that new science telescope is orbiting in that node point around it. We're seeing deeper in the universe than we ever have before. So what we're saying is, okay, scientists, the universe is indeed huge. Well, our God is bigger than the universe. Nah, come on. What can be bigger than the universe? Well, it's so big, we don't even know how big it is. And you're saying your God is bigger than the universe? Oh, yeah. I can prove it. What do you mean you can prove it? Well, through science. Well, how can you prove that through science? That your God is bigger than the universe? Well, yeah, there was a point in which the universe didn't exist, right? Right, a scientist will say. And that thing is called by you the Big Bang. Right, the Big Bang. So, at the Big Bang, the entirety of the universe did not exist before the Big Bang, and after the Big Bang, it came into existence. Yes, it did. And so since in causality, this is Aristotelian logic, all things have a cause. Anything that happens has a cause. That thing has a cause. That thing has a cause. That thing has a cause. So according to Aristotle, what is the first cause that had no thing causing it? The uncaused causality, Aristotle says, is God himself. Aristotle says this. Everything has a cause, except the first thing. So even in modern science today, you can claim that God is bigger than the universe because the uncaused cause that caused the entire universe is God himself. It's very uncomfortable to bring that to the thought. In fact, that's why when you talk about science history, when the whole Big Bang idea started to emerge, and this is back in the 50s and 60s, it wasn't that long ago, it was really resisted by the scientific community because it gives those darn creationists too much ammunition. It was easier just to say that the universe always has been eternity past and always will be eternity future. That's much more convenient for us, and sure enough, when you see the series Cosmos, Carl Sagan says, the universe, it always has been, always will be. Well, that was the uniform idea of how the universe was. But now, the uncomfortable truth, which is generally accepted in the scientific community, is the universe had a beginning. So what caused it? And we'd say, page 1 of the Bible, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It's very uncomfortable for scientists. So yes, the God we're talking about is bigger than the universe. He's outside the universe. He's not constrained by the universe. He made it himself. He made everything. See right there? In heaven and in earth. He made everything. That's consistent with the uncaused causality of the Big Bang. It's very much the same. So he doesn't need you to serve him with human hands. He doesn't need anything. In fact, he gives to you breath and everything. So this is the God I'm talking about, this unknown God. This is the God. Now, he's blowing their mind right here. They're probably being slightly entertained. They're probably chuckling about, there's no way a God can be that big. I mean, Zeus is big, but that's crazy big. And Paul's saying, we're talking crazy big. Crazy big. Which begs a bigger question. A God that's that big, what does he care about you? I mean, what does that mean to me? A God that's that big? I mean, I'm an irrelevant little in the universe. And Paul's going to try and bring this closer to home. Okay, so he goes on. He says, when we get to man's purpose, he made from one man, talking about Adam, he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place. That they should, and here comes the purpose statement. So he says, all the people on the earth, you think you're something because you're Greeks. The Jews think they're something because they live in Palestine. There's people all over the world that live in different ethnic groups and different geographies and at different times. And Paul is saying, this God who's bigger than everything, even the universe, is the God who actually is responsible for all these people being on the earth. And not just Israel, by the way, because at the time news had moved its way to Athens and to Greece, that those Jews down in Palestine, man, they think they're really hot stuff. They call themselves God's chosen people, like they're the only people on the earth. And you would expect a representative from that group to come into Athens and say, well, I come from the hot people of the entire planet. God has chosen us. We're really something else. Too bad for you. So great for me. And this kind of ethnic superiority. But what Paul's saying right here is the God I'm talking about made everybody, not just the Jews, made everybody, including you. Over all the epochs, all the times, all the places. So, why would a God of the universe, who started the Big Bang, who brought about this gigantic universe, why would this God be interested in man at all? I mean, more than he would be interested, say, in bacteria or in any other life form. Why would he be interested in man? So here's where we push up to man's purpose, that they should seek God. Okay, wait. Stop the bus. Are you saying that God, who's bigger than the universe you claim, Paul, made all mankind on the earth, and not just the Jews, but everybody in every epoch and every geography? He made mankind for the purpose that they would seek this Creator God? Yes, that's their purpose, to seek God. Why would a God that big even care? Why would he want to be connected with his creatures, the mankind? I mean, why would he do that? Well, of course, we know the answer to that. For God so loved the world that he gave his son, because he loves this creation of mankind. That's why. But here's what he's saying. I'm trying to tell you, Paul says, I'm talking about a God who's bigger than the entire universe, and he's made all mankind on the earth, and the purpose he made mankind is so that they'll seek God. Now, this sounds very relationship-oriented, right? Like we're going to knock on the door of God, say, God, are you there? Can we have a relationship? It seems almost preposterous that the creature, mankind, should have some kind of place to be in the presence of the gigantic Creator himself. And this gigantic Creator himself would want that. See, so now we're really blowing minds right here. Big God, big Creator, bigger than everything, doesn't need you for anything, but he wants you to find him. Relationship. We're made for relationship. So this is why he does this. So this is blowing their minds. He's made you that you should seek God and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him. Now, I always get a picture of a guy who's blind, who's feeling around in the dark, because this is exactly the word he's using. In different translations, he uses the word grope. Sort of grope your way around. So here's an interesting idea. The God who made everything, who's bigger than everything, made you, and as part of mankind, made you so that you'll seek God. However, you're going to have to do it by groping in the dark. And perhaps groping, feel their way toward him and find him. So this isn't a game of cat and mouse. This is a God creator who's waiting for people whose hearts are turned in such a way that they want to understand this creator God. And in understanding this creator, all they have to do is start groping in the dark and they'll find him. If you really want him. Now, you'll say that's blasphemy in terms of salvation. I don't think it's blasphemy. The deal is that someone whose heart is genuinely set on knowing God, who actually in the dark of night looks up at the sky, raises your hand and says, God, if you're there, I want to know you're there. I want to see, I'm seeking you. I fully believe that through God's Spirit, he answers the prayer of someone like that and then starts the ball rolling that brings him to salvation. For a heart that's really desirous. I think that's true. So he's saying, God, this gigantic, unbelievably huge creator God, wants to be found by you. That's the purpose of man. So if someone's on their dying deathbed and says, I don't know what the purpose of life was. I don't know if I accomplished what I was supposed to do. What is the purpose? Why was I here? What was this whole part of my years being on earth all about? To seek God. And he'll let you find him. Have you ever wanted to seek God? You'll find him. That's the purpose. So if anyone asks you, what's the purpose of man? That's it right there. That's it, to find God. And God will let you find him. Even though you know that for you it's like groping in a dark room. Like, I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to find the exit door to this room. All I can do is just feel the walls. And maybe I'll find God in this process of doing that. So it's a nice tantamount kind of admission of the fact that in seeking God, seeking a God who's bigger than the universe, how in the world do you do that? Right? How do you do that? That's just like a stupidly impossible task. Because it seems as though it's easier for God to find you than it is for you to find God. Ah, wow. That's the interesting thing. For those who seek God, God will make himself found by you. The responsibility of being found is on God's part. But it starts with you wanting to know God. And God answers that prayer. And he admits freely that it's a tough thing to do, but God will still allow you to find him. He also says, yet he's actually not far from each one of us. So as you're groping along the walls in this dark room trying to find God, you turn around and find out he was standing next to you the whole time. This is a great picture. This is a great picture. So again, if you look at the Greek pantheon of gods, they are gods who are peripherally connected to mankind in different ways. But they are distant, but not impossibly distant, because they do have some connections. So if I want to find Zeus, I can find him in the ways that Zeus manages the world and stuff like that. But if you're talking about a God who's bigger than the entire universe, I don't know how to reach up to him. He's bigger. He's outside the universe. Where do I go outside the universe to find a God who's bigger than the universe? And Paul says, I understand. I hear you. But because he's outside the universe, he's also inside his creation, and he's right next to you. What? Which implies very strongly that for those who understand that it seems impossible for me to grope around and find God, God has already solved the problem, and he's right next to you. So you mean, as I'm groping in the room, I can actually say, God, if you're somewhere in this room, I'd like you to reveal yourself. And God responds and says, "Ho, here I am." And this is how God operates with mankind. And this is what he's saying. So Paul's saying this God who's bigger than the universe is also completely infused through the universe. He's part of it, and he's accessible to you. And we know that's true about his Spirit. And he draws people to himself. So Paul's painting a huge picture of God, but a God who made mankind so that they'll seek him, and a God who guarantees that if they seek him, they'll find him. And Jesus said this, knock and the door will be open. Right? Seek and you'll find. That's what this is all about. But you got to be seeking. You got to be seeking. There's a problem with mankind. Well, many problems with mankind. But one of the problems with mankind is they're not actually seeking God. They don't want to seek God. It's too threatening in so many ways because we'd rather see ourselves as being the sovereign rulers of our universe. Don't want to invite a God who might be next to us. And so that's why when the psalmist writes, Psalm 14 was the other one. There you go. When the psalmist writes in Psalm 14 and 53, he says, the fool says in his heart, there is no God. Does that sound like someone who's seeking God? No. He's someone who's already prejudged that God doesn't even exist. What a fool. A fool says in his heart, there is no God, and these people are all corrupt. They do abominable deeds. There is none who does good. And the Lord looks down from heaven on the children of man to see if there are any who understand, if there's any who seek after God. Nope. They've all turned aside. Together they become corrupt. There's none who does good. Nope, not even one. Okay, that might be kind of an overstatement in many respects. But it's true what he's saying. Our nature, born as our nature, is not to seek God. It's to seek our best. It's to have us be the center of the universe. So in this particular case, what Paul is saying is if you seek God, God will let you find him. But if, like Psalm 14 and Psalm 53, if you say there is no God, what are you seeking? There's nothing to seek. And those people are fools. They're fools. I'll come back to this. For he uses actually some of their own poets to sort of amplify the truth. For in him we live and move and have our being. Okay, so, Paul is quoting Greek poets, actually poets from Crete as well in a second here. He's quoting these secular guys. Is he actually endorsing everything these secular poets and philosophers are saying? No. But he is saying that in what they say, there is some truth in what they say that lines up with what I'm saying about the truth of the universe. And here's one of those things. How can an impossibly huge God who made the universe be relatable? Well, he's relatable to me because he's not far from me. And even one of your own poets says that. So not that foreign of a thought to you guys, you Greek dudes. And another interesting thought from a Greek poet. One of your poets has said, for we are indeed his offspring. We are indeed his offspring. Now, this brings in an interesting problem in a lot of ways and another interesting solution in another way. And it's this. If there is a God who's bigger than the universe, he's clearly not like me. Right? I mean, that makes sense. He's bigger than everything. I can't be like him. And yet we know biblically that we're made in his image. There is something common about us. Doesn't mean I can elevate myself to being equal to God, but it does mean that he made me in a way that makes me relatable to God. And when we talked about the fact in the Old Testament about animals having offspring, it always says they have offspring of their own kind. And because they're of their own kind, and they can reproduce with others of their own kind and make it reproduce again. So of their own kind, there's this relationship. He's using that idea back there. It's actually an animal husbandry idea. Animals have offspring of their own kind, which makes them relatable. What he's saying right here is he's using this poet to state what we already know, that God made us in his image, which means there's something about us that makes us able to relate to God. That's what he's saying. And he says, one of your own poets says that. We're indeed his offspring, which means he made us and we can relate to him. So again, here's this is a wonderful thing. This God is not far from any of us, even though he's gigantically huge. And we're his offspring, which means that by nature we can relate to him. Yay. Now, it doesn't mean that you're God's, by the way. And this passage has been used to prove that means you're God. That means you're equivalent to God. It's not what he's saying. Not what he's saying. What he's saying is that we have the ability to be relatable to him. So then, being God's offspring, made in his image, we ought not to think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and imagination of man. And again, I think he's pointing at examples all over town when he says that. So he says, hey, look, here's the craziness. If you are his offspring, which means you're relatable to him, then what are you doing making an image of a God that is made out of stone and silver and gold? Does that make any sense that this God that we can relate to is actually a little statue of gold like the beginning of Raiders of the Lost Ark? Does that make any sense? Paul's saying, no, that doesn't make any sense at all. There's this God who's bigger than the universe, who's made you to seek him, and he wants to be found by you, and he wants to relate to you, and you are relatable to him because you're his offspring. You're made in his image. It doesn't make sense that you have ivory and stone and gold idols. Way out of place. Way out of place. So man's purpose is to seek for God and find him. And then finally we get to creation's destiny. Well, he says, okay, verse 30, the times of ignorance God overlooked. But now he commands all people everywhere to, so you see the timeline he's talking about? There was time before where God would say, ignorant, but not anymore. Ding. Something happened. Destiny has happened. We've gotten to a point in the calendar. He commands all people everywhere to repent. For what? What did I do wrong? I've had people say this to me. You say you got to repent to God? Well, I didn't do anything against God. Well, I didn't offend him. What did I do against him? And this is where the vineyard starts to help you understand. Because in a real sense, mankind is like the tenants in that vineyard who are squatting. They're squatting on God's property, and they're not honoring him or thanking him. And that is grotesquely offensive to the creator of the universe. I'll show you more about this in a second. Romans 1. The question that comes up in Romans 1 is, how about people who've never heard of Jesus? And he says, actually, creation shows who God is. And although they knew God through what the creation is like, they didn't honor him as God or give thanks to him. And you can apply this to the vineyard idea as well. Although they knew the owner of the vineyard, they didn't honor him or give thanks, did they? He just said, it's ours, we got it now, there we go. And this is the attitude of sinful mankind. I've got this great existence. I've got this body that works. I am not responsible for it. I just inherited it. Good for me. Everyone's got this. I have great things I have food to eat. Everything's fine. The blessing of sunshine, which we had yesterday, but not today. But I mean, there's all this great stuff that goes on. And I enjoy all this vineyard stuff. And I never recognize that it came from God or thank him for it. That's the offense of mankind. Don't honor him or give thanks. We'll come back to Romans 1 because it applies here. So here's creation's destiny. He's fixed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he's appointed. Remember the vineyard case? Sends his son. Judgment's coming. Day of reckoning. Okay? There's a time coming where you can't ignore the fact that you're a squatter on God's creation anymore and you're not honoring or thanking him because of it. There's a day coming for that. So here's how Paul is kind of giving him a sense of urgency. Okay, we have this big God. That's his nature. We have this God who's made us to seek him and to be found by him. But by the way, there's a day coming where all this is going to come to an end. You can't wait this ride out forever. There's going to be coming, like in the vineyard example, there's a day of reckoning coming where God will say, I'm done with this. I'm done with this. And everyone on this place that I've built, that I've blessed you with, everyone that's here who does not honor me as being God or thankful to me, they're going to go away with the creation when I wipe this creation out. It's gone. That's just the big picture. That's what's going to happen. It's what's going to happen. He's fixed a day, which means on the calendar of heaven, God has already penciled in a date. Oh, he hasn't penciled it in. He wrote it in ink. There's a day in ink on God's calendar saying the end. And this is where judgment will come, and the vineyard owner will wrap up the vineyard and all the tenants. And those who have sought him and found him will be preserved through that process. But those who haven't, who stiff-arm God and say, I'm not going to honor him and I'm not going to thank him, they're going to go away with the creation that they hang on to, that God's going to wrap up and finish. That's just the way it is. And so how do we know that's going to happen? He's going to judge the world in righteousness by a man, which seems crazy. Wait, you mean the God of the universe, who you yourself, Paul, said is bigger than everything? I mean, if anyone's going to judge the tenants on this piece of world, it should be the guy who made everything. And Paul could stand back and say, well, yeah, that's actually right. But he's a man. I thought you said this God who's bigger than everything, he's a man? How can that be a man? That can't be a man who judges everything, unless you're telling me that this man is the same creator as the God in the beginning of the universe. And I think these are where the wheels are turning in the Athenians' minds. Through a man. Okay, wait. So what man are you talking about? You see the curiosity is, so in a sense, he's sort of allowing them to pull out of him what's going on. What man are you talking about who's qualified, who actually made the universe? What? In a little book called Your God is Too Small, he says, if we're gonna invent a man who came from a God who created the universe, he would probably look like this. And he goes through the logical arguments about what he would look like, and he ends up looking just like Jesus. It's a great book. Your God is too small. Okay, man who? Well, this man whom he's appointed and he's qualified, giving assurance to all by raising him from the dead. So look for a man who is clearly outside the universe. That is, he actually comes back from the dead. The natural world, the creation, when things die, they die forever. But something that comes back to life is giving you a gigantic hint that he, in a way, is not of this place. And that's what the resurrection does. So Paul tells them there is judgment coming. The landowner is going to come and judge the tenants who don't honor the landowner. This judgment is coming. It's written on the calendar, and it's going to be done through a man so he can relate to our problems and our understanding. He can relate to us perfectly. But he's also the guy who created everything, and we can prove who that guy is because he's come back from the dead. He's clearly demonstrated a nature that is outside of this place. He comes back from the dead. Remember, Jesus says, I'm in this world, but I'm not of this world. He says to apostles, you're in this world, but you're not of this world. There's something otherworldly about what happens when God brings us into his family, because that's who Jesus is. He's like that. Well, he's given us assurance to all by raising from the dead. And this word assurance, given assurance, is Paul saying we have rock solid proof. This is the plan. That's the man. You need to do something about this. And right here, his message stops. No, I'm not stopping it. He stopped it. But look at the response at this point, because this is pretty cool. So now when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some mocked. That doesn't happen. No one can come back from the dead. You're right. That's why we call it a miracle. Hello? No one can come back from the dead. So they mocked him for that. But others said, we will hear you again about this. So notice, that's actually a great response. What Paul has done in this beginning thing, in these 3 points about God's nature and about man's purpose and about creation's destiny, is he's just raised a billion questions. He's raised a billion questions. This man who's raised from the dead is the creator of the universe, and he's going to judge us all because we're like, tenants on a land that he owns. And when's this going to happen? I mean, teacher, I have 1,000 questions, but my head's already full. You're talking about us being able to have a relationship with the creator of the entire universe? The entire creator who's bigger than all the stars I see in the sky at night? Talking about a relationship with him? And there's something about this man who came back from the dead that proves that he's the same guy as the creator? And the judges? He's just scrambled their heads. He hasn't finished the gospel message, but what he's done is he's taken this little door that's been cracked open slightly. You want to know about this unknown God you don't know anything about? Well, let me add more to that. And he's just he's invited them to crank that door wide open to talk about it more. They want to know more about this man who came back from the dead. They want to know more about this man as creator. They want to know, what am I supposed to do then? I mean, it sounds like I'm in big danger. If this man is going to judge us, I got to know how to get right with this, because you said he's going to judge in righteousness. In righteousness. He's going to judge us based on goodness. And I think I'm toast in that category. So this should open up 1,000 questions in their mind. And I'll just say, when you start talking about the gospel with someone and you find a door of relevance that you can crack open, and then you start to put a little bit more information behind that, which he's done here, although this is a lot of information in a short amount of time. But he hasn't fully explained any of this. He hasn't really talked about what Jesus has done for us to solve the problem. Have you noticed that? But he has intriguingly painted the biggest picture he can, which relates down to them at an individual level. And they now want to know more. Now, some of them will mock. Some people will just say, it's crazy talk. But some people go, if what you're saying is true, I need to know more. And that's exactly what they say. I need to know more. So resist the temptation to back up your dump truck of theology and dump it on people's heads. All Paul has done has taken the biggest picture of what's going on in the gospel and taken that door and cracked it open a little bit more. And those who want to know about more, he'll fill their minds with things they've never heard before. And those who don't want to hear it, they'll just mock. And that's okay. So when we talk about the gospel with people, find a relevant door to walk through and give them just enough information after that to intrigue their curiosity, so at that point they can actually pull out of you what they want to know. Now, I've been in situations many times where you get to that point and people start pulling information out of you faster than you can supply it. Wait. And then there's another thing I got. So there's a point at which their hearts are hungry and curious. You have to actually go into a process after this where they try and pull the information out of you. This is really, really smart. And it's also very respectful of people's interests. If people don't have an interest in the gospel at this point, well, you've planted some seeds, and someday maybe that seed will sprout and curiosity will happen, but they don't have the full story yet. They'll come find you and they'll call you up or they'll send you a text message. You said, can you tell me, and then you know that God's tugging on their hearts and drawing them to himself. So it's a wonderful process to just be just a slight step and just a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more. It's a great way to do it. It's a great way to do it. We'll hear you again about this. So Paul went out from the midst. So he stopped right there. He didn't answer any questions on the Areopagus. I get so frustrated by this. Paul, you could have stood up there and said, so now let me tell you about Jesus. He doesn't. He doesn't even use his name. He's just got them so intrigued that from this point on, they're going to try and pull this out of them as much as they can. This is great. This is how you do it. Paul went out from their midst, but But some men, they did join him and believed, among whom also were Dionysius the Areopagite and a woman named Damaris and others with them. I like it. This is like the third time in a row that Paul has mentioned people who respond to the gospel, and there's women there. Yeah. They joined him and believed. And I have to believe that when they did that, when it says they joined him, it doesn't mean they joined his movement. It meant that they went after him and said, we need to talk. Wait, can we have some coffee and together and tomorrow? We got to talk because I'm intrigued by what you're saying, but something inside of me is tugging me and telling me that this rings true in some large sense about the universe and this judgment that's coming and the fact that I will not survive that because it's in righteous and I got to know more. So they joined with him to have this conversation continue on. And so that's what they did. Okay, so we need to quit right there. So remember, we've got God's nature, who he is. He made everything. He doesn't need you, but he wants you because of man's purpose. He wants you to seek him and to find him. That's the purpose of life for the creation he's made for us. And then on top of that, at the end, there's a day of reckoning coming where none of us is going to avoid this. None of us is going to avoid this. That's creation's destiny, and you're part of that creation. I mean, that's just the way it is. This paints the biggest picture possible you can paint that puts a context for the gospel. Now, when Paul talked to Jews, they already knew this. But to a pagan who doesn't know the Old Testament, they don't know this. And to a secular scientific world, they don't know this. So that's why Paul decides, based on his audience, to take the biggest picture possible and to tell them just enough that for those who are interested, they'll push the door open and ask more. And they'll continue to go down that path. It's a great approach. So here on the left, we have the Areopagus, and on the right, we have this temple with the Parthenon on top of it. And just a couple of closing comments about this, because this is an interesting contrast. Over there on the left, on the Areopagus, Paul didn't give them the entire story, but he did give them the biggest story. The biggest story. Even though he came to talk about religious items, he didn't go over to the Parthenon and discuss about why that's all trash. You notice that? He didn't go over and say, oh man, this whole Parthenon thing is just a joke. You know, and you guys bring your sacrifices here and you do the crazy, what are you doing here? And he could have gone in apologetic mode about why everything on the left of that picture was wrong. He doesn't do that. On the Areopagus, in a very common sense, he says, let me tell you the big picture that's true, that you don't know. And so here's how he does it. Some final observations about this. First off, you got to look for a genuine door in people's lives. That's why I started with the door. You got to find a genuine door. What are people struggling with that you know God can meet that need? What is it that you know that their ears will be attentive to, where their lives and the needs of their lives are looking for a relevant answer? A relevant answer. But to be relevant, you got to understand where their lives are at. You got to listen to them. You got to know what they're dealing with. You got to know what they're struggling with. So every time I talk to someone who doesn't really have any biblical understanding, you just listen and say, well, what's life like? What are you struggling with? You know, what do you believe? Do you have an interest in spiritual stuff? You think UFOs are actually demons? No, don't go there. But I mean, you can talk about 1,000 different things, but you got to find out where the relevance is, and that relevance will open a door and say, okay, I can speak to something that'll speak to that relevant need. You got to find that, and you can only do that by listening. Sharing the gospel starts with lots of listening. Lots of listening. And for Paul, since he was in Athens by himself, he was waiting for the other guys to come down from Berea. Remember, he's there by himself. He wanders the town, and he has some discussions in the marketplace, and he talks to people, and he notices things until finally, because of what he notices, he starts speaking to that need to understand the unknown God. And then people say, hey, we want to know about that. Say you come on Saturday to the Areopagus, and we go up there and you tell everybody in town what you know about this. We're curious about what you have to say. Like, can you see that door swing open? They want to listen to him. And they actually invite him to come speak. He doesn't barge into the Areopagus. They pull him there. And he speaks. So again, look for a genuine door. It's just I can't emphasize that enough when it comes to talking about the gospel. By the way, he talked a lot of big picture theology and didn't use a single religious word. I am a personal adherent to banning religious words in common conversation. Because all they really do is obfuscate. Oh, there's one of those words right there. All they really do is they tend to cloud the issue. The words are useful to us who understand the background about what the words mean. And I'm talking about very easy words like salvation, even repentance and redemption. I mean, all of those words mean something from a theological perspective, which are not bad. They're actually very, very good. And we use them as a shorthand. But you can't use that shorthand with people who don't know anything about the Bible. So what you got to say is, well, there's this being who made everything. And he doesn't need you, but he also made all humanity so that they'll seek him and he'll let you find him. Yeah, but there's a day coming where he's going to judge those who don't do that. So what do you think? That was all Paul said. There's no religious stuff in there at all. There's no religious stuff in there. But if they're interested, they'll ask more. Judged by a man who's the creator? You see what I'm saying? So when you talk to people about the gospel, just throw away all those words. By the way, you can take the word salvation, for instance. Let's use that as an example. You can describe what salvation means by saying a sentence. So instead of using the word, say a sentence. Say a sentence. Salvation? No. Even when we go back, we were talking about the Exodus before. Salvation for the Jews in Exodus was two-part. It was being pulled out of one existence and brought into another existence. The word salvation in Greek always means to be taken out of a tight, closed space and brought out into the open. It was the idea of being taken out of a jail and being brought out to an open field and being freed. So the word salvation is always a transition from something to something. What am I saved from? And we often in Christian circles say, well, I'm saved from judgment. We talk about the Passover. I'm saved from the wrath of God. Yeah, but what are you saved to? Well, I don't know. As long as I don't experience that, I'm okay. No, you're saved from a life that's not life, that's holding you captive, and you're saved to real life in relationship with God because you sought him and he let you find him. That's life. That's life. So when you talk about salvation, that's how I talk about it. I've been pulled out of this one thing, which is very suboptimal, horrible experience. Things are bad. And he's brought me into a relationship with him, and that changes everything in terms of what life looks like. Well, that's salvation. Oh, but by the way, to be pulled out of this is going to cost something. And then you start talking about the cost that's paid through Jesus, the redemption that comes from that, redeeming, paying for. I never used the word redemption. Redemption, back as when I was a kid, was what you did with green stamps. When your mom got green stamps and you buy stuff, and you take your green stamps to a redemption center, and you would trade in your green stamps that you got for every transaction you did, and you'd get free stuff there, like mixers. Stuff like that. So that's redemption. You pay a price. I don't use the word redemption because we don't even have green stamps anymore for you to understand what that means. No, it costs something. What do you mean it costs something? Well, you're enslaved to it and you're indebted to it and you've offended God. And yeah. So anyway, you can get there without using big words. So just get rid of those words. If you meet another believer where you use the same shorthand, use the words. Nothing wrong with that. It's faster, it's easier, we understand. However, I will make a caveat here, and for those of you with an LDS background, you'll understand, or maybe you're coming to understand, that the vocabulary, the religious vocabulary, is redefined between those two worlds, between the biblical world and the LDS world. They're redefined. And so it looks like you're talking about the same thing when you use those words, but until you actually use more sentences to find out what the word means, you won't realize you're talking about two different things. So that's also one of the dangers of using words in the wrong context. Just use a sentence. It won't take you much longer. Use a sentence. Okay. Also, start with the biggest picture. For someone who knows nothing about the Bible, start with the biggest picture. And what is the biggest picture? Well, let me tell you about God's nature. He made everything. He's bigger than everything. He doesn't need you for anything. He made everything. In fact, he keeps giving to you. So start with the biggest picture. And then talk about the fact that there's a problem here, But God wants you to find him. He'll let you find him. If your heart is sincerely wanting to seek him, he'll let you find him. And he'll do that. So you can go start with the biggest picture. If you jump from the biggest picture to talking about being saved by the blood of Christ, questions will come up like, well, what is saved? What am I saved from? I don't think I really need to be saved and redeemed and bought. Why do I need to be purchased? I mean, you're just jumping the gun. Start the biggest picture and then see where their interest is and let them pull you into how the picture gets worked out from God's design. That's really the best way to do it. Biggest picture. In this case, it'll allow you to be pulled into more detail as they ask. So that's a tremendous way to do sharing the gospel. And by the way, you still need to warn them that a day is coming. You do it in a winsome way. Don't climb all over them with hailstones and stuff like that. You need to tell them, before I finish the big picture, I got to let you know there is an end to this big picture, and that end to the big picture is God's judgment, and that day is coming. We often don't want to talk about that because it makes the gospel sound too negative. But it's the reality of the thing. And Paul, in his first exposure to the Athenians, decides this is an important issue we need to lay on the table. You just can't say, well, I'll figure this out someday. Well, no, there's a someday on the calendar where God's going to judge. So, the writers in the New Testament and the Old say, look, as long as it's called today, do it. Don't put off tomorrow. I mean, as long as today is called today, you need to, because you just don't know when on the calendar this is going to happen. But there is a day, and it's coming. So there is an inevitability about the judgment that we need to give people an idea about, but be winsome about it and say, I don't want to rain on your parade, but this really is coming. It is. Okay. Winsomely warn people. Okay, so let's get back to the vineyard. The vineyard is a great picture of the biggest picture of God's relationship with the tenants, us. And even in the process of us working the vineyard, that's what you do every day, right? It's what Adam and Eve did when they worked the garden, right? They maintained the garden. Was it just because God needed you to work the place? No. But in the process of working the place, you develop a relationship with God. In the process of developing or working in this place, you come to understand the nature of God. And Paul says in Romans 1, that's because of how creation is. You relate with creation and you work the place, you start to understand how the place's creator is. So that's the brilliance of this. So again, that's the big picture right there. If I take Romans 1 and I retranslate it into vineyard talk, it looks like this. This is from Romans 1, my version of Romans 1. For the landlord's invisible attributes, remember he's not there when the tenants are there. The landlord's invisible attributes, namely his vast resources, his generous heart, have been clearly perceived ever since the planting of this vineyard in the things that have grown here. So they are without excuse. They're without excuse. Although they knew the landlord, they didn't honor him as the owner or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking and their foolish hearts were darkened. It's exactly what happened to the tenants in the vineyard. This is exactly what goes on in the hearts of mankind in God's vineyard. Exactly this. So here's what Romans 1 looks like for real when we talk about the big picture over here. For his invisible attributes, remember, this is the God who's bigger than the universe. His invisible attributes, namely his eternal power, his divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. We'll talk about that in a second. So they're without excuse. For although they knew God, they didn't honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking and their foolish hearts were darkened. So there is indeed a way in which, remember he talks about groping in the dark to find God. Part of that groping is noticing what the creation looks like. And in noticing what the creation looks like, it starts to give you a picture of the nature of who God is. And God did that deliberately to serve notice to mankind about who the invisible creator is like. And so Paul says in Romans 1, so those who've never heard the gospel are without excuse because there's enough in creation for them to understand. There's enough in creation to allow them to seek the creator who made this place. Now, in modern science, there's more of this happening like every day. Some of the recent discoveries inside the mechanisms of the cell not just cells in your body, but cells in plants and stuff like that. There is remarkable stuff going in there that even 100 years ago, they thought there was just goo in the cells. And now they look inside there, and there's an extraordinarily organized mechanisms and factories and machines doing stuff inside your cell. So that scientists look at this in a microscope, and they back off and say, whoa, there is some serious stuff going inside here. Where did this come from? And they're just kind of scratching the surface about what's in there. It looks like it's highly organized. That's very disturbing to a scientist who believes that we came from nothing out of randomness. And yet you look inside a single cell and you see a city of organized activity. This is a big deal. This is a big deal. So now we know that something started the universe. Now we know that on a large scale, on a small scale, something looks like it designed what's going on inside my cells. Because it's like, wow. It's machinery, it's factories, it's little robots doing stuff. It's crazy stuff that's going on inside there, even on the smallest scale. Something on the smallest scale looks as deliberate as something on the largest scale. And then even, we talk about the fact, as coming out of physics myself, is the fact that there's these coefficients in the universe that describe how things relate. Like, do you know that there's a number that tells you how much two planets will suck together because of gravity? There's a number. There's a number that tells you how much it does that. And if that number is a little bit too small, there's no life in the universe. And if that number is a little bit too large, there's no life in the universe. There's just this little narrow window that, boy, aren't we lucky that the gravity constant is this much. I measured that constant when I was in college with a laser. It's very small, but it's in the right range. Well, it turns out that the gravity constant is the only thing that's like that. There's on the order of 2 to 3 dozen of these fundamental numbers of the universe. We just observe and say, this is what it is. Hey, let's run an experiment. What would happen if we made this number a little bit too big? Oh, we all die. Well, what happens if we make this number too small? Oh, we all die. And that's true in a very narrow range for dozens of physical constants in the universe. Man, aren't we lucky that they're all okay in the right range? Well, and physicists have seen that and they say, yeah, that's a little disturbing. That looks kind of designed too. So I know how we'll answer that. That is so randomly improbable that could ever happen by chance, although we know everything happened by chance, but that's so improbable, then we must be one of many universes that exist that we can't see and we have no evidence for. And out of a gazillion universes, parallel universes that all exist right now, out of a gazillion universes, one of them struck it rich, and that was us. So really the odds aren't that small when you have the fact that there's actually a gazillion universes. But the problem is there's no evidence for that. It's a mental experiment. It's one way of saying, I'm a little uncomfortable with how fine-tuned this place is. I'm a little uncomfortable to see these little machines inside the cell. I'm a little uncomfortable that the universe had a beginning. So as science goes on, it keeps pointing to the fact, and it does exactly what Paul says right here. They really are without excuse, because the heavens are telling of the glory of God. And throughout all the history of mankind, there has been enough evidence in the Creator's creation, because of who he is, that the creation itself tells us who he is. And this has informed cultures throughout all of mankind's existence. There must be a God. There must be a God. So that's why in Psalm 14, only fools say there's no God. So, okay, we need to quit. I've run way out of time. We're going to sing this song. I was right, Maya. Yeah. So let's just pray. Father, we thank you for preserving your word for us. We thank you for you yourself opening the door of our heart and our mind to listen to who you are, and what you're proposing to us. And Lord, we understand that door opening in our heart isn't something that we do independently because we're so smart. It's something that you actually draw us to, and our hearts open. And as our hearts open and we are curious about who you are, and we understand the problem we have being captive of our own sin, we ask you and we seek you. And in seeking you, you let us find you. And Lord, we can't take credit for any of that process. That's just an astonishing thing. And yet here we are, 2,000 years after Paul wrote these words, in a place completely on the other side of the planet from where he wrote these words. And yet here we are, understanding and coming to believe the same thing, because your Spirit works in and through us, through every time, through every place, through all mankind, for those who genuinely seek God, and you allow them to find you. So, Lord, thank you for allowing us to find you, and thank you for allowing us the opportunity to share the big picture with people and to share the smaller and deeper and more intimate pictures of how you've solved the problem of mankind through the blood of Christ. So thanks for these words now in Jesus' name. Amen.